going on, guys? Waco from Revolution here with my horological buddy Constant Kwong. And we are here to tell you why we think the Lemania 2310/Omega Calibre 321 is the greatest chronograph caliber ever made. So of course there's people who are going to ask, what is the criteria? So the criteria is as follows. Number one, what's the first thing, Constant?
Number one is that this is the longest production manual chronograph in the history of chronographs. Started from 1942, so it is 82 years old this year.
Number two is that the Lemania 2310, which forms the basis for the Calibre 321 from Omega, was the only chronograph movement that was so robust that it passed all of NASA's extreme torture tests to create a watch that could go to space, otherwise known as the Omega Speedmaster. And criteria number three, Constant?
Number three, of course, this is the chronograph that was used by multiple big brands that we all know today. Breguet, Patek Philippe, Vacheron. And it actually is the movement that kickstarts the renaissance of the chronograph in the 80s.
Yeah, following the quartz crisis, we had a complete destruction of complications.
Right.
And this is a movement that basically saved the mechanical chronograph after the quartz crisis. So the first thing that you need to know is who created this incredible movement. His name was Albert Gustave Piguet, and he was an absolute genius. So in the context of the 1930s, Albert Gustave Piguet joins Lemania. So let's cut back to 1930. You have three companies getting together. You have Lemania, Tissot, and Omega to create a company called SSIH.
That's right.
Société Suisse pour l'Industrie Horlogère. Woo! So let's examine what's happening in the 1930s. You have the birth of the wristwatch chronograph.
That's right.
And you have two players in particular that become super well known for these type of watches. The first one is?
The Patek Philippe with the reference 130. It was launched in 1934.
Yeah, an incredible watch, but in 1936 you have a really cool watch also, which is?
Yes, it is the Longines with the 13ZN flyback chronograph. It's the first ever serialized flyback chronograph as well in the world.
So SSIH has some pretty cool movements. If you know a little bit about Omega history, you know they have the 19 CHRO, which was first introduced in 1898, which is their first pocket watch movement with a chronograph function. That was followed by the 18 CHRO. And then you have a couple of other movements like in the 39 CHRO. But all of these movements were kind of old fashioned. They were all derived from existing pocket watch movements.
Right, yeah.
And what Omega needed was a modern chronograph caliber, and that's what they told Albert Gustave Piguet, go and create the best one.
Yes, and he did with the introduction of the CH27 chrono movement.
It is called the CH27 because it is 27 mm in diameter and just 6.74 mm in terms of thickness.
That's ridiculous, man.
Which in the context of 1942 when it was launched was mind-blowing.
It is.
It is the smallest and thinnest chronograph movement of all time, and finally gives Omega the opportunity to make small wristwatch chronographs. So let's compare this to a watch from that period as well, and that is the Patek Reference 130. The Patek Reference 130 is using the Calibre 13-130 made by Valjoux.
That's right.
And that movement is 13 lines or 29 mm in terms of diameter.
That's correct, yeah.
The watch is 33 mm in diameter.
Yes.
And as a result, you have the two counters, one for the continuous seconds and one for the minutes, all the way at the perimeter of the dial. And it's kind of unbalanced. And so it was clearly in the mind of Albert Gustave Piguet, I want to make a movement small enough so I can create balance for my wristwatches.
And he did, basically.
So actually, one of the interesting things about the Lemania 2310 is there's two versions. Just so that you guys are not confused, essentially the Calibre 321 and the Lemania 2310 are the same movement, but at this point you have a divergence, right?
That's right.
So Lemania decides to offer two versions of this movement. One is for 3 counter watches, which means you have a minute totalizer, but also an hour totalizer.
That's right.
And that's called the CH27-12P.
That's right.
And that's what Omega starts to use. It's important to understand this because later, there's going to be a version called the 2320, otherwise known as the CH27-17P.
That's right.
And this will be a 2-counter 21 jewel movement, which will be the basis of what all the high-end watch brands will use to bring back mechanical chronographs like Patek, like Vacheron, like Breguet, like Roger Dubuis.
And we're going to talk about them in a bit.
And we'll talk about that in part 2, but let's talk about first in part 1, the brand that is most associated with this incredible caliber, and that is Omega!
Omega! Yes!
We're both wearing Omegas on our wrists. So I'm wearing an Ed White, which is otherwise known as a ST105.03, and it is in fact the watch that was certified by NASA for the astronauts to wear to go to the moon.
This is the Omega Ultraman. right? This was made in 1967. As much as I know, only in 1967, right? With a special order, like special orange hand. It should be on the archive. And this is the reference 145.012. Is that right?
Yes. What year did Omega start using the 321?
The movement was created by Lemania in 1942, but Omega only started using it in 1946.
And what references would you find that movement in?
Omega uses it in the Seamasters and also some DeVille's as well. So that's where we'll find some of the 321's calibers before Speedmasters.
But in fact, the movement finds its perfect home in 1957.
Yes,
what
that's
watch
right.
is that?
So it is, of course, the Omega Speedmaster that was launched in 1957.
And this is an amazing, groundbreaking chronograph. Why? Well, first of all, it is the very first chronograph to feature a scale called the tachymeter on its bezel for higher visibility, right? So what's a tachymeter? Well, in the context of the 1950s, if you're a race car driver or you want to look like a race car driver, this is just about the coolest watch that you could possibly have on your wrist. You have a scale that allows you to calculate the average speed inside of a car over either 1 mile or 1 kilometer, depending on what the scale is calculated for. And this gives you this kind of like roguish coolness when you rock up to like a party or something. People are looking at your watch and it's got a tachymeter on it and they're like, bro, do you race cars? And you're like, how did you know?
I mean, it's really cool. I mean, at that era, especially when you have the very first watch, as you mentioned, that has a outer rim, outer tachymeter on the bezel, the first time ever. And you must understand all of the context of the chronographs, all of the meter scale, whichever tachymeter or telemeter is inside the watch.
So always on the dial.
Aggressive design. This is the very first time that comes
in fact, it's such a groundbreaking design that it basically sets the paradigm for every other chronograph that comes after.
That's right.
Would you agree?
I will agree. And then many people didn't know that, and this is actually a fact.
Right. So how did the watch get adopted by NASA? NASA was essentially looking for an official watch for the astronauts, right? And so they tested watches from many different brands. We won't name exactly all of them because the ones that didn't make it probably are not so happy. But Omega was the one that passed all of the tests with flying colors. And it was in fact a 105.03, the same watch that I'm wearing on my wrist right now.
That's right.
That was the watch that certified Omega to become the official watch of astronauts.
Maybe you want to tell them how rigorous are the NASA tests for these watches in general?
Yeah, basically they put it inside a squirrel, set it on fire. The point is that even though the movement will appear later in some of the most refined watches on all of haute horlogerie, it is one of the most shock-resistant and accurate movements of all time, right? Now, Omega continues to use the Calibre 321 from 1957 up until 1968.
68, yeah, 68, 69?
And in 69, it changes for another movement, which is using a shuttle cam instead of a column wheel. And so we should actually now at this point talk about what it is about the architecture of the Calibre 321 / Lemania 2310 that we love so much. Look at the size of the balance wheel relative to the rest of the movement. It's got an exceptionally large balance wheel. Right? And this balance wheel is super important because this is the motor that drives everything, right? So this compact architecture, which is at the time the smallest chronograph ever made, it's got an amazing sense of logic with the way in which it's arrayed. And it's got a beauty because of that.
That's right.
Now it's really interesting because later on it also becomes a canvas for expression for some of the most beautiful brands in all of Swiss watchmaking. But if you look at it just even in its most bare form, in its semi-industrialized state as used in the 321, it is still a masterpiece of architecture. Would you agree?
That's right, and also it's a technological advanced movement as well. 2310 or the 321 is actually a very complicated chronograph. But yet it is super reliable. 82 years, it must be reliable. And many of my watchmaker friends that service a 2310 say that it is actually the most robust, easiest to service movement because it's just made so well.
If you look at the 321, it allows for the maximum of adjustability even in terms of the depth of the drive wheel relative to the chronograph wheel.
That's right.
And that is a revelation at the time. However, it takes a lot of human skill and human labor in order to achieve this. And as we're moving into the late 60s and into the 70s, we're trying to scale up, we're trying to become more industrial.
That's right.
The decision is to make a chronograph movement that necessitates less adjustment. That's the rationale for the shuttle cam as opposed to the column wheel, right?
I'm sure. I definitely agree. That is the time where industrialization is taking flight. They want to increase the production of all these watches. Having the Lemania 2310 might not be the answer back then.
At this point, the Calibre 321 kind of disappears from Omega for many, many years. Right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've always loved about Omega, and in particular Reynold and Greg Kissling as head of product, is that they listen to their customers.
That's right.
And the thing that they heard recurringly over and over and over again was, bro, bring back the
3-2-1.
Calibre 321. And so what I love about Reynold is in 2019, he gave the people what they wanted.
That's right.
He actually bought the 321 back. But it wasn't so easy as that, because yes, we mentioned that the Lemania 2310 was responsible for creating the renaissance of mechanical chronographs in the 1980s, but that was the 2-register 21 jewel
That's
version,
right.
otherwise known as the 2320
yeah.
or the CH27-17P. The 17 jewel version with 3 counters was not made anymore.
Not made
So
anymore.
what did Reynold and his team do?
So basically, they did a 3D thermography on the original 321 movement and created from scratch a CH27-12P, which is essentially original 321. So this is the 321 Omega Speedmaster 321 reissue. Of course, as mentioned, it comes with now open case back. You know, now you can finally admire the new and improve, I would say, the 321 movement that was made again by Omega. And now comes with this Sedna Gold treated bridges, which is really beautiful.
It's stunning to behold. Honestly, it's one of the most beautiful watches around. And I have to say, that's one of the things I've really admired about a modern Omega, is that not only do they listen to what customers want, not only do they go into their archives to create things inspired by their past, but Reynold and his team are constantly improving the quality of the watches. And when you put this watch on your wrist, it looks like the watch on my wrist, but it feels so much better.
Oh yeah,
Like,
it's more robust.
no disrespect, but the old watches feel like old watches. This feels absolutely perfect. Like, it's so beautifully realized. The bracelet is amazing,
Amazing,
so
yeah.
solid. Every single dimension of it has been
amazing.
optimized to be a watch that you can wear for today and use for today.
I think one thing also to mention is that if you look at the, I mean, it's not just a reconstructed or a fully built up 321, but if you look at the design of the watch, it's based on the watch that you have, you know, it's exactly the same, you know, the flat link bracelet, you have all this smaller case size, and it's, when you put it together, you can really see that this watch is actually basically a real reissue of what you have on your wrist.
Absolutely.
Which is really cool.
There you go. We talked about the 3 criteria as to why we think the Lemania 2310/Omega 321 is the greatest chronograph caliber of all time. We talked about the fact that it's been in production for 82 years, which is amazing. You can't say that about any other chronograph caliber on the market today. We talked about the fact that it formed the underpinnings for the 321, which was the only movement robust enough to be certified by NASA to go to space with the astronauts in the Omega Speedmaster.
Yes.
Hang around for part 2, because now we're going to talk about how this amazing movement basically was responsible for the renaissance of the mechanical chronograph in the 1980s.
Can't wait to talk about that. So stay tuned for part 2.
It's going to be super fun.